the problem of legislative spamming, as we call them, or amendment spamming, is not new to this parliament. I mean, it happened before, it happened during this convocation. Unfortunately, we did not address the issue when we still had the time in the beginning of our convocation, though there were several drafts as to how amend the rules of procedure so that we don't face this problem, at least not to the extent like it is now. However, many parliamentarians had seen that as sort of infringement on their right to submit amendments and propose legislation in general. So, but yes, we did expect resistance. Yes, we sort of knew where it was expected from. It doesn't matter much in terms of the number of amendments, whether there's 16,000 or 6,000. It will take, if you go through all the amendments, it just takes too much time for anything. But yeah, the absolute record of 16,000 amendments, as a matter of fact, some people went into the trouble to count the words in the law itself. There are fewer words than there are amendments to the document. So that tells you something. So yes, we did expect it. Quite frankly, I don't know whether there are any serious negotiations going with the people who have submitted the amendments. I hope they will move forward and will take a more constructive position, because the law does require serious consideration. I mean, there are legitimate reasons to ask for amendments. However, certainly not in the number that we have received now. That just makes the whole thing pretty much impossible to complete. Well, like I said, the rules and procedures have to be changed first, and that is difficult to reach consensus on, because many parliamentarians would see any sort of prohibition for amendments as infringement on their right as a parliamentarian to propose legislation. Of course, in cases like this, the best case scenario is negotiating with the author of the amendments for him to withdraw the amendments and not demand the voting on those amendments. That's the best strategy, and my understanding is that that's what's going on. And by the way, quite frankly, the law had been dubbed, or the proposed draft had been dubbed Anti-Kolomoisky law, which is, in my humble opinion, is not. The issue that the draft is trying to resolve is much greater. We had a lot of banks that have been knocked out, and National Bank had to take them out of the market. It's not only a Ukrainian problem, it's obviously a very common problem. You don't just put a bank back on the market after the bank went bankrupt. It's not possible. I mean, just imagine all the procedures that the regulator has to go through, the monies that have been paid out to people who had the deposits in the bank, the bank that lost its reputation, money, clients. You don't just put them back on the market with the decision of a court or a regulator and expect them to just restart. It doesn't happen that way. So the issue is much greater. I'll tell you more. Given the fact that Kolomoisky had been in courts for some time now, and we know there are a lot of I don't even know, it's in the dozens, the number of proceedings in different courts, both in Ukraine and abroad, actually. My issue with this name for this draft, Anti-Kolomoisky, is that it's not going to affect, or it will not have the necessary effect, if you want, on the cases that Kolomoisky is pursuing in the courts now, because the law doesn't go back in time, and there are a lot of issues that will come up just procedurally. The courts who are considering the claims, Kolomoisky's claims, cannot just switch to the new law. They have to finish certain proceedings under the old laws, and there's a huge question mark on the issue of whether they can just use the new law to finish the cases that Kolomoisky brought in earlier. So it's another big question whether that particular issue of Kolomoisky and Privat Band could be resolved with this piece of legislation. I know the Rules and Procedure Committee is working on some proposals and some techniques, let's call them that, to go around this issue. But again, my understanding is that the authors of the amendments, those that were the most productive ones, they sort of demonstrated openness to negotiations, which is a totally different issue. I mean, the ethical questions that it raises is a different issue. However, it would not be the right way to do it, to go into the same process that we went with the land reform. Although most of the amendments, great majority, did not make any sense, there were quite a few that did make sense, that did need to be considered and voted on. Whereas here, we also have quite a few of those, and too bad the attention of parliamentarians is distracted now from those that are from the amendments that are really necessary and those that make no sense. So for now, I'd say the strategy should be discussing it, negotiating it, finding out, explaining what sort of strategy the authors of the amendments have, and whether they're going to reach the desired effect at all. So it's a political negotiation now that I can see as the most effective tool in the absence of due amendments to the rules and procedures, which we cannot vote now anyways. Well, it's not a secret that we, within the party, within the faction, we do have differences, serious differences of opinion on many serious issues. And quite frankly, some of the amendments do make a lot of sense. And I myself, I didn't propose any amendments given the situation that is developing. But I certainly asked my colleagues in the line committee to look at certain issues. For me, there's some especially troubling issues where we changing the procedure with which the courts are supposed to consider such cases and make certain decisions. There are some really not very high quality, let's put it that way, proposals that will just make the procedure impossible. But yes, we do have people within the faction who hold different views on this particular problem. They have made their views very clear. They are trying to gain support. I know people have been going around and trying these particular members of faction and trying to gather more support, explaining this ideological difference in their view of how Ukraine's banking system and economy in general should be developing, and whether IMF should have as much say as it does in terms of what sort of legislative proposals we make and adopt. From the very beginning, this issue was a very difficult one to come to a common decision. We have agreed from the very beginning of this convocation that we realize that we will have difficulties on agreeing on certain issues. And the land law was a very good example, is a very good example. There are people who just flat against accepting any sort of land market regulations right now. And they made their position very clear from the very beginning. Quite frankly, it was, in my opinion, an unfortunate practice to go in the way of the so-called turbo regime, because that distracted a lot of attention and that made the whole process of um, building the faction, building the trust within the faction, and bringing people together on important issues very difficult. Because when you had 60 plus laws that you plan to consider within few months period, it's difficult to do the work of gathering the necessary support, of explaining the strategic issues, and the land law is certainly one of those. So yes, I wouldn't call it a crisis, but we see that as a very serious test on how the faction could function. Those issues that are less controversial, we don't have a problem with the faction getting together and giving the votes. But those that are very controversial proved to be a difficult test for the monocoalition, which we still are, to survive. That brought up issues of how we should be coordinating further work on basically everything. Now we have better understanding of what our colleagues are standing for. We have better ways of working out the deals. You have to do it, and yes, we realize within our faction too. The best tool that has been very effective in all sorts of circumstances is, of course, a nice talk with the president, where we all get together and the president comes in and the prime minister and key ministers, where we have a very frank discussion of what the differences are, what we're trying to achieve, and basically getting that allowed to have the land law passed, where we had a very frank discussion, where we had very open floor for everyone, and moved forward and made certain what's the word I'm looking for, concessions to each other that allowed us to work. So that is the tool. We are very open for the discussion. We still know how effective the president could be when we sitting there in the same room and everyone has the opportunity to ask openly any questions they might have. And that allowed for more than once to change the position that some of our colleagues have taken. So that's our hope for this particular issue too. Oh, well, right now, of course, the fighting COVID-19 is the number one issue, and the current time, the fact that the RADA cannot work in the regular regime has brought the necessity to work out different sorts of tools to continue work. For example, the committees, pretty much all the committees now had their first meetings online, which is pretty effective. So we use this time and this opportunity to do more work in the committees to consider the legislation that we didn't have time to make it a better quality. So right now, the passing of the law on budget, the changes to the law on budget that will allow us to fight, to go through the quarantine, to fight the COVID-19 problem. Hopefully we'll succeed, and we're expecting another extraordinary meeting in the parliament early next week, probably Monday, most likely. But then the major issues are, of course, the ones that have been discussed for some time, the issue of the territorial reform, the administrative reform, as we call it. That requires changes to the constitution. That requires a lot of discussions. That requires understanding in the society what it is that we're trying to reach, and building up consensus in the society first of all, and then within the parliament on how we proceed. Though we have done a lot, and you might recall that President had to withdraw his proposals because of let's put it that way, poor communications and lack of this mutual agreement. However, we believe we have moved forward a lot in terms of building up that consensus in the society. So that, of course, is a very important issue in terms of how we go about the main promise that we have made when we ran the campaign, the peace process.
Mm-hmm.
That now is the issue number one after we go through the COVID-19 problem and the budgetary changes. All the attention will be towards administrative territorial reform and building up consensus in the society on how we approach the peace process, what we're willing to accept, and what the strategy would be so that we move forward. And for the time the local elections happen this fall, we have a more or less agreed strategy on how we approach the whole process of territorial reform and reintegration of the occupied territories. We certainly hope that the law will get passed, the funds will get unlocked. It's extremely important in not as much in terms of the amount of money that will be available, but the general effect that it will have on the financial system for Ukraine. We certainly cannot allow Ukraine to not to perform on its financial obligations. And there are funds available. There are different programs that could do a lot. In terms of how the financial system in general is doing, I'm not a financier myself, not a banker, but my colleagues who do know the banking system very well, they insist that the banking system, after the years 2014 and 2015, when a lot was happening, have built up strength, and it's very capable now. There's enough liquidity. The National Bank of Ukraine has developed sufficient expertise and has enough tool and authority to oversee the banking system and not to allow the financial crisis to hit unexpectedly. So we pretty calm on that issue. The financial system can handle the problems that are coming in, and we know with how economy is doing, we will have some problems there. But certainly, the main issue with negotiations with IMF and other financial institutions is the sort of building up the strength in the system and the capabilities in the system to restart the economy quickly after the COVID-19 ends.